Welcome to another Photography Simplified video. My name's Chris, and in these videos, I simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take better photos. In today's video, we'll be covering ISO and how you can actually change your camera's sensor sensitivity to light. However, we're going to mention some of the dangers in doing that. Let's get into it. So what is ISO? Well, in film cameras, photographers would buy different film depending on how bright the situation they were going to be shooting in was going to be. You'd want film that is more sensitive for darker situations and less sensitive for lighter situations. So film would have different numbers, like 200 or 400, for example. The same can be true in our digital cameras. Your camera sensor can be dialed to be more sensitive to light if you're shooting in a darker situation or less sensitive in a lighter situation. ISO is measured in numbers, and each time the ISO number is doubled, the sensor sensitivity to light is doubled as well. Your individual camera may have a different range of ISOs depending on its capabilities. If you find this video helpful, by the way, please leave a like and subscribe so you can see other beginner videos as well that will help cover different topics to improve your photography. ISO is part of the exposure triangle. I'll have videos covering the other topics in the exposure triangle, but what you need to know is that the aperture is how much light we allow to enter your camera's lens. The shutter speed is how long we capture light, and our ISO, which we're covering today, is how sensitive we let our sensor be to the light. When we have a low ISO number, we're going to typically have darker images if we're only looking at ISO because our sensor is going to be less sensitive to that light. When we increase our ISO number and increase its sensitivity, we're also going to make the image brighter because we're now making the sensor more sensitive to that light. Let's look at an example using the camera of how changing only the ISO can affect the brightness of an image. I have my camera here set up in manual mode so we can focus on changing only the ISO to see how the brightness in our image changes. We can see that right now the ISO is at its lowest option, 100, and the image is fairly dark. As I increase the ISO, we can see that the image gets brighter and brighter. Now, there are some dangers in raising your ISO, and one of those dangers is adding what's called noise. Just like if you turn the volume on a microphone way up, you'll hear a lot more static and feedback. The same happens when we increase our ISO too high. Because we're not actually changing the amount of light that we're capturing, we're just digitally changing the sensitivity of the sensor, we introduce noise as we bump our ISO up. Some cameras will have better capabilities than others, but photos taken at higher ISO numbers or high ISO numbers will typically be noisier or grainier looking, which is less sharp and appealing. Let's look at an example of taking a photo of the same scene using different ISOs and looking at the difference in noise between the images. I'm going to first take a photo at the lowest ISO setting on my camera, which is ISO 100. Here's that image. You can see that there's not much graininess, and this is a pretty clear image. Now let's increase our ISO to ISO 800, somewhere more near the middle of my camera's range, and take another photo. You can see that in this photo, there is now a little bit more grain as we've bumped up that ISO. Let's bump it up one more time, all the way to as high as the camera will let us set it, and take that photo. Now you can see in this last photo that there is a lot of grain or noise in the image. This is the danger of raising our ISO too high. That's why we generally want to try to use our other camera settings to get as much light as we can first and adjust our ISO last. If you're finding this video helpful, there may be more helpful content in my book, Photography Simplified. If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon.
The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information.
Now, knowing that raising your ISO can introduce noise and grain, you might wonder, why would you ever want to do that? However, there are some situations where this can be useful. For example, let's say you're shooting indoors and it's slightly darker and you don't have a tripod, so you can't use a slower shutter speed to capture more light. In that case, you may want to bump up the ISO a little bit, allowing you to shoot handheld without having to slow your shutter speed too much. Or maybe you're trying to capture wildlife or sports similarly in a dark or low-lit environment. If you're trying to target a certain setting and you have your shutter speed or aperture or other camera settings where you want them, often the ISO is the last option to bump up to allow us to keep the other settings where we want them. One example where I've used higher ISOs is astrophotography. If you're trying to capture things like the Milky Way, for instance, in those very, very dark places, you'll need to bump up the ISO in order to capture the stars clearly without having to use a shutter speed that is extremely low. Hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has, please check out my other videos.